Over the past several months, board games have become a bigger part of my gaming life. To avoid the difficulty of planning and scheduling D&D games with a bunch of busy adults, my wife and I have started to pick up a small amount of board games to casually play with whatever group of friends we might end up hanging out with on a random weekend. While the themes of the games do excite me, they sometimes leave me wanting more in terms of an immersive experience that I'm used to with terrain-filled RPGs or war games. I was sent this new game called Furylands to do an ad read for, but while looking at it and its components, I thought about playing it with some friends. It had a bunch of cool cards and standees and character sheets and, most interestingly, battle mats for the encounters. They looked fun, but they lacked that three-dimensional aspect of tabletop gaming that I really love. So I thought, why not just bring the two things together, board games and handcrafted terrain? And I decided to craft an in-game scale building from one of the scenarios, the Seer's Hut. This was an ideal game to do this with, since it was based off of a 1-inch grid system, so anything I would make would perfectly transition into other tabletop games. I grabbed some XPS foam and got to work. I broke down a large chunk into one that was big enough to give me a 6.5-inch circle, but small enough to clear the arm of my Proxon when spinning it. Making circular structures can be tricky, so I decided to go the one piece of foam route for the floors, the wall, and the ceiling. Once I had my outer circle cut, I did a second cut with a 3-inch radius to give me both my outer walls and my 6-inch inner floor. Of course, you can only make one-piece walls like this if you're using thick enough foam, which can be hard to buy in person, but you can get it online from XPS Supply. I've got a link in the description if you want to order some. The inner circle needed to be sliced in order to make the floor and the ceiling piece. The problem is that 6 inches is just a bit too tall to run through the Proxon like this. Thankfully, you can get away with flexing the wire arm up a little bit to give more clearance by stuffing in some shims. I cut one slice about 1/2 inch thick for the floors and another thinner one for the ceiling. This will be used to lock the removable roof in place later. I laid out my 1-inch grid. At first I messed up with how it was placed, but in the end I got it right and matching with the game board. To define the 1-inch squares, I did a shallow cut along each line with an X-Acto, followed by a pass in the cut with a dull pencil to slightly bevel the edges of each square. Again, wanting to match the game board, I went with an exaggerated wood grain texture using a pencil, rather than the more realistic one with a wire brush. I also did the alternating direction of the grain from square to square. This is not a realistic way to do it at all, but it captures that great iconic Dungeons & Dragons map style. Using the mat as a guide, I marked and cut out the door opening, and I put this cutout piece aside for later. The outer ring got hot glued to the base before moving on to cutting some square stock strips to turn into rounded wooden beams. I then did a similar process making stone pillars to flank the doorway just like the one on the battle mat. I could have drawn and carved the log pattern right onto the foam walls, but personally, I find it easier to just make and apply a veneer of separate strips. This also gives things a bit more dimension. An efficient way to do this is to cut some large strips of foam to a few millimeters thick. Then add wood grain to the whole piece, then cut those into smaller strips at the width you want. It's even better if you don't use a straight edge for this to get a bit of a wave in your cuts so they look more like separate logs when applied. A very important step is mixing up all the strips after you make them so you don't just put them on in the same order they were cut, causing them to fit together too perfectly, ruining the entire effect. Then it's just a matter of gluing them in place. I like using hot glue for this because it instantly holds the planks in place while bending them around the curve of the structure. Any overhang on the top can be sliced off, then a pencil can be used to enhance those separations between the planks. I didn't want to make the interior also logs or planks because, well, one, it would mean a bunch more work, but also, it would make the whole piece look too samey. I like the idea that the inside looks different than the outside, and decided to go with a plaster finish for the interior walls. And since the walls were made out of one continuous piece of foam, this could be done simply by adding a bit of texture with a rock and a foil ball, and a few cracks for good measure. An important step to making this not look like just a chunk of foam was to add wood grain to all the appropriate edges and end pieces. and to make areas like this little exposed portion of the floor look like two separate building materials of wood plank and a stone foundation. This makes the whole thing look a lot more believable despite being very simple. The reason I kept that cutout from the door is because I could just insert it back to be a removable door piece. I think this is far more practical than figuring out a way to hinge it or to just have the actual door itself pop in and out. This piece could be made up to incorporate the door, the wall material, and the stone foundation and steps. And adding these little steps not only made it look more detailed, it made the elevation of the door actually make some sort of sense. I've never done it like this on a building before, and I think it's awesome. It fits super snug, comes out quickly and easily, and perfectly blends in. I think it's an absolutely eloquent solution, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to use it again going forward. Now, before I get into the somewhat silly process of figuring out how to make a large, round, pointed cone piece of foam for the roof, I want to take a second to tell you about this Furylands game, which is the sponsor of this video. Furylands Ashes of Avalon from Wario's Games is a cooperative fantasy RPG board game for up to 4 players. In Furylands, you get to create your own customized character and create your own class to play through a massive campaign with over 40 hours of content, which is endlessly replayable. This character customization is what sets the game apart from others. You really get to play your character any way you want, and with the extensive skill system being a defining feature of the game, it allows you to play through the game again and again in different ways with different characters. With a wide variety of possible quests, items, and skills, each playthrough will be truly unique. The vast amount of content in some fantasy board games can be overwhelming and complicated, but Furylands keeps things fast and simple, both to set up and to play. This gives you more time to actually play the game, as you're going to be spending less time setting it up and putting it away. This game is coming soon, and if you want to get it, make sure you follow the link in my description to sign up for the pre-launch and ensure you don't miss out. Making the roof was an exploratory process. I had an inner disc that would sit inside, but needed an overhanging one that was peaked and cone-shaped, and I wasn't sure how to do it. I had a wood craft circle that was the perfect circumference, but I needed to transfer that to a big chunk of foam and have the foam cut to an angle to make that pitched roof. So I figured I could use the circle as a guide for the hot wire and attached it to some thick foam using double-sided tape. I then adjusted my wire to approximately 45 degrees and tried to cut the foam while spinning the whole thing, keeping the wood disc against the wire and not shifting where the circle was relative to the surface of the cutter. This was so much harder than I expected. Had I somehow attached the wood disc to a single point to have it work like the circle jig does, it would have made this a lot easier. Thankfully, after a lot of messing around and several passes, I ended up with a fairly evenly cut pointed cone. We got there in the end. I realized that the wire had left lines all over it that kind of looked like thatch roofing. And I thought, hey, why don't I go that route? I've never done a thatch roof on a build video before, and it would save me from making and applying hundreds of individual shingles on a curved roof, which is kind of a pain. So with a wire brush, I went to town giving the foam lots of extra texture that would hopefully read as straw once complete. This looked pretty good, but it lacked the layered effect that thatch roofs actually have. To compensate for that, and to just make the thing look more interesting, I cut a bunch more square strips and applied them on top. Once in place, I beveled all the corners to make them look like rough-hewn logs, and added the pencil wood grain. I was then able to go around and apply a bunch more strips of thinner material horizontally, so that it would look like the wood was holding down the thatch, while simultaneously hiding the fact that there were no overlapping straw rows. I know that this sort of outer batten scenario isn't typical of most thatched roofs, but I've definitely seen it before in real life, and this is a fantasy house, so I'm gonna say it's fine. I know someone is tempted to write a lengthy comment essay rant about how this is not the way thatched roofs work. And to that I say, go have a tea, mate, take a breather, eat some beans on some toast, and let this one go. The next angry comment people are queuing up is, where's the window? Well, it's right friggin' here. The seer living in the hut is a baller. and can easily pay the king's window tax. These are windows that I had previously cut out of some thin plasticard and hadn't had a chance to use yet. I made a windowsill, a header, and some shutters to really dress up this rather simple looking exterior, and I think the whole thing looked charming, but was missing a few very small details like a door handle, which I cut out of a very small balsa wood strip, and some cross bracing for the shutters, which I cut out of the same balsa strip, but sliced even thinner with my X-Acto. And finally, cross bracing on the door, which I decided to embed by cutting in a groove. This is because the door was actually slightly curved, so I couldn't attach a straight piece of rigid material to it. And I'm glad I couldn't just glue it on top, because I think it looks better like this. This hut was now complete, but needed paint. I opted for a mostly airbrush approach here, since I was happy with all the fine detail and didn't want to obscure it with Mod Podge and thick craft paint. Using polyurethane primer would also ensure no issues with things rubbing off later, since I was planning on using some oil washes for weathering. Now, historically, I'm prone to taking things too far with weathering. I like a darker, grittier, more grim aesthetic, but I was particularly happy with how the colors were looking on this hut, and I imagined it to be a well-kept building based on the nicer furnishings the map showed being inside of it. This wasn't an old, creepy, decrepit cabin. This was a newer, lived in, and loved home. So I kept my oil wash light and didn't go too crazy with it. I didn't cover all the plaster, and I didn't cover the thatch, mostly just the woodwork. I barely had to wipe off any excess once it was dry. I really like this little building. It's just big enough to justify having a playable interior, something I've not been a fan of in the past, but I'm glad I did it here. I think the way the roof comes off and locks in place, as well as the door, is just great. It's definitely my favorite aspect of this project. And the thatched roof. I've wanted to do one for a while, but have avoided it because I wasn't sure how to actually do it in a way that I liked, and I think I like this way. I'll certainly be expanding on it further in the future. I truly hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit the like button and leave me a comment. And if you can share it with a friend or a hobby group, that'd be great. If you want to pick up some tools or supplies for your own hobby needs and support the channel in the process, head over to blackmagicraft.ca. There I have an essential equipment page where I list all the stuff I use regularly. If you really like what I do and you want to help me keep making it, the best way you can do that is by supporting the channel on Patreon. See you on the next one. Cheers.